Hello and welcome to Lecture 8 of the Philosophy of Race and Racism. Today we're going to be talking about the work of Miranda Fricker and some of the work that I've done to expand on Fricker's accounts of testimonial and hermeneutical injustice. We'll start here. There are various ways to know something. You might know the lyrics to a song, for instance, that the lyrics are such and such. You might know how to perform the song, alternatively, like how to sing the lyrics. You might have written them, so you might have first-hand knowledge of them. Now, thinking of a different example, you might know someone by acquaintance. For instance, we met, so you know me because of that. You also might know someone indirectly. For example, I suspect you only know something about Lin-Manuel, but because you've never met him. But if you don't, let me school you. He's fantastic. We know how to do many things, and we know that many things are true. Knowing by acquaintance or description, as those two previous examples were, fall into the latter category. You know that chili is delicious, only if you've actually tasted it. So acquaintance. You know that it's cold outside before stepping outside because of your weather app. That's description. Lots of what we know by description or secondhand is learned from testimony. If somebody trustworthy tells you it's raining, but you haven't been outside, and it is in fact raining, and you believe them, then you know this because of their testimony. We often provide testimony to others, friends or family, physicians, lawyers, professors. Often the word testimony or testify is used in religious interactions or maybe legal interactions. Here, of course, it should be clear, I'm using this more broadly. Testimony is just information being transmitted from one person to another. And when we provide this testimony to others, they either treat us as an appropriate source of knowledge or not. We're evaluated implicitly often by others insofar as we're able to provide accurate testimony. And we in turn evaluate others. And sometimes speakers should not be given much credibility. For example, if they've established to you that they are untrustworthy or prone to bullshit. Just a side note here. Bullshit is what happens when somebody doesn't care whether what they say is true or false, and doesn't care if others believe them. Lying is distinct. It occurs when somebody deceives others into believing something that the speaker believes is false. So when I say bullshit, I just basically mean people who are saying whatever they want and they don't care what happens. But deception is a little more malevolent. In any event, sometimes speakers should be given more credibility than we give them most others. For example, if they're an expert on a given topic like Anthony Fauci. Most often, however, when we're talking about areas where speakers lack expertise, it's reasonable for credibility to be evenly distributed, roughly speaking. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Speakers are often given credibility deficits and credibility excesses owing to unreasonable prejudice. For example, testimony by women is routinely discounted by men, and philosophy talks, unfortunately, have been a sad example of this. Numerous occasions, numerous interactions between a speaker and somebody in an audience asking a question or posing a comment to the speaker. When posed by a woman, several examples of this sort of just these comments just being ignored, and then picked up later by men in the audience and championed as great examples of questions. This is a real phenomenon that happens. Credibility deficit there was given to the woman speaker and an excess given to the later man speaker. At the same time, men are often given this sort of credibility that they don't deserve. These sorts of excesses and deficits, they track intersections of identity. I'll give you a real world case here. Not that the one I just gave you wasn't real world, but organ transplant listing. So you have to go meet with physicians to see if you can be listed for organ transplants. You have to demonstrate that you're able to, provide enough social support in your background, your family, for instance, to be listed. So, because this is associated, roughly speaking, with good outcomes, so survival. So, now, there's not really a good definition, never has been, for what social support means in this context. And so often physicians have to judge it on a case-by-case basis based on whatever information they think is relevant. So marriage would be a good example of social support, right? Or a close-knit family. or a traditional nuclear family. But you can probably see where I'm going with it. For me, it'd be real easy, right? They would listen to me. If I needed an organ, I could probably get away with just telling them, just as charmingly as I could, that I have social support. Of course I do. And I would get by a lot easier doing that. I wouldn't have to prove as much. And that's the thing that's relevant here, right? I wouldn't have to do as much as a black woman would in that same situation for no other reason than prejudice. Now, that's part and parcel of testimonial injustice. There's a different sort of injustice that's worth discussing too that's nearby. We also learn things and know things based on our own reflections, using linguistic and conceptual resources that we get from our communities. In some cases, we need new concepts to understand novel situations. For example, while we all understood quickly what social distancing means, this concept quickly entered into our thought during the pandemic, and now we use it all the time. It helped frame conversations about how to proceed during the crisis. And concepts like this are often created during times of crisis as a way to aid interpersonal communication and individual understanding. That's not always the case, though, that concepts are so easy to construct. Carmita Wood, she coined the term sexual harassment. Now, prior to the movement surrounding this, women had been harassed in the workplace for years, often explaining away behaviors of harassers as something like just what men do, or that guy had a bad day, or something like this. Now, the lack of conceptual resources in this sort of scenario plausibly made it harder for people who were being harmed by sexual harassment to identify that harm, that they were actually being harmed. Now, this is not to say that they didn't know they were being harmed. Of course they did. But it's different from conceptualizing what's happening, right? You can know you're being harmed and not exactly understand why. It made it even more difficult, this lack of understanding, to stop that harm from continuing. I mean, what would you tell an HR rep, right? I mean, Carmita had to come up with the concepts to get the HR reps to pay attention to what she was saying. After getting together with women who'd been similarly harassed, Carmita reported often hearing, "I thought I was the only one this was happening to." The lack of this concept, the lack of this sort of discussion made people feel alone and isolated. And that's another way in which the harm persists, right? If people aren't talking about it and aren't sharing it and thinking they're the only ones it's happening to, then how is it going to change, right? Words and concepts are powerful. They allow for identification of and ability to rally around in a way that helps stop injustices from continuing. It also aids self-understanding in some cases by providing a vocabulary to which to understand oneself in another way. The systematic gaps in the development of that vocabulary is itself harmful. And Carmita's push to have sexual harassment recognized was resisted, and claims of harassment were often dismissed. And Carmita's testimony wasn't given the credibility it deserved, all of which undermined Carmita's ability to make sense of the harms happening to her in the workplace. That is the essence of what Fricker calls hermeneutical injustice. It's an injustice that occurs owing to gaps in collective conceptual resources needed to understand the harms happening. It might be due to one group having concepts another lacks. It also might be due to the broader group lacking needed concepts, like in Carmita's case. Now, these are good to point out, these different injustices, and good to point out so that we can address them. And that brings us here to some work that I've been doing on hermeneutical testimonial justice. Now, Fricker did us all the service by identifying these epistemic injustices. That's the general class she lumped hermeneutical and testimonial injustice under. They're both a sort of epistemic injustice, that is to say, injustice insofar as you are a knower. But Fricker didn't provide much way to address them. Now, Fricker did suggest we needed to cultivate better listening skills, and gesturing something like, if each of us individually do this sort of work, we can create a waterfall of justice, as it were. This might strike you as insufficient, given that much of the credibility deficits causing the injustices we see or can identify using this framework owe to structural prejudice. And this may strike you more insufficient, given that we all in general need to be better listeners. So saying that doesn't really identify what's special about this situation. What seems needed is re-education for privileged speakers but not at the expense or exploitation of marginalized individuals. Privileged speakers need to learn the conversational skills and the experiences that they lack. Put another way, privileged speakers need to understand that they blind spots and exhibit meta-resistance. And these blind spots are gaps in experiences that are hard to recognize. And meta-resistance is affective or cognitive or economic, social, conceptual, or whatever resistance to recognizing that one has a blind spot. Addressing the latter seems the first step in addressing the former. And for that reason, we will turn very soon to Charles Mill's white ignorance, which is a form of motivated ignorance that protects privileged individuals from their own shame. And as I've said, privileged individuals have lots to gain by remaining ignorant. We read Mills, we're going to have more insight into what it is that's blocking understanding from the perspective of privileged individuals. And I think he's right about what he says. And from there we can read off, and we will read off, how to approach this re-education process